society. I blew my mind.
We're still alive.
Anyway, they're not all, this one's deceased, but we've had one previous to this. We did one for Marilyn when she had her book
Yeah, we're still
come out.
alive.
Yes, that's good. And we're gonna have one for Agatha. She has a book, it's come out.
Yeah, she gotta write a book.
But haven't
It's-
done
it's-
anything.
You need to bring.
It's called
So do we have to
Lost Midsummers, and it's a really great novel, so.
Definitely.
It'll probably be, yeah, it'll probably be sometime in May, April, May.
Whenever it's possible.
I'm a bit of a fraud doing this because I know very little about Mary Oliver. In fact, most of what I know came after she died. And one reason I learned something about her is there was so much on Facebook about her. So many people were so interested, and I thought, I missed something. So I started reading her, and to my delight, she is very much an American transcendentalist movement. She even has a poem where she ends up sort of thumping you over the head with it. It's called On Not Mowing the Lawn. The last lines are, let the blades of grass surge back from the last cutting. Or, if you want to be poetic, the leaves of grass. So I wanted to have this because there's so many people excited about Mary Oliver. I thought that'd be fun, and also it turns out I do like her poetry. But also I think it's just a nice change from the bleakness of the political world out there to do something different. So, thank you all for coming today. As Donna can attest, I was frightened no one would come since the ice, so you are true fans of Mary Oliver. The poem I chose, I'll get things started, and
Thanks, Dad.
after that, Marge is videotaping back there. If someone wants to bail her out, just grab that machine from her. I'm having a
gonna
videotape
read?
because I have relatives who like,
Oh, I'll
would like
take
to see
over
it,
for
and
you
some
when you
people
read.
couldn't come today, etc. What else? There's this, if you wouldn't mind, I might send out something to everyone tomorrow or the next day about who read what. It's a sign-up sheet. So I know some people are changing the poem. Could you just change it? Some people are added to the list. If you aren't on the list, add to
I
it.
think we got on
I don't think Ken.
Ken's on
Yeah.
last. He
That
went
was
to
on
the
there.
Google Doc and put himself last. Like the
Okay,
general
I have a
knowledge.
short poem to start things off, and after that, we can be free about the order to go in. And I actually brought visual aids for this poem. It's called What Can I Do? And the opening line, I chose it for the opening line, which you'll see. Two things, I call them wands because I think they're magical. Yeah, I don't know how they work. 2 for 1 TV. I thought I was alone in having 2 for 1 TV, but her poem, how many people have 2 wands for 1 TV? Everyone. It shows how out of it I am.
And none of us know how to work them.
Anyway, here's the poem, What I Can Do. The television has 2 instruments that control it. I get confused. The washer asks me, do you want regular or delicate? Honestly, I just want clean. Everything is like that. I won't even mention cell phones. I can turn on the light of the lamp beside my chair where a book is waiting, but that's about it. Oh yes, and I can strike a match and make fire. So, does someone just want to walk up, or I can read off the list?
Just read off the list.
Read off the list. Allison.
You want us standing up here?
You can be wherever you want to be.
Is this a meditation bench holding up the sign?
Yes.
So, I was introduced to Mary Oliver's work, I think in 1979, which tells you how old I am, in a workshop in Los Angeles with a woman named Holly Prado. She introduced me to her work. And she read a poem called Skunk Cabbage, which I highly recommend. I'm not going to read it today. And I think what struck me about Mary Oliver's work right away was just her simplicity of language, her incredible imagery, and of course her connection to Earth, which I thought was just beautiful. The poem I'm gonna read is called, oh, one other thing, I took a workshop with her once. When I lived in Denver, and she concentrated completely on tiny minutia, you know, the effect of a comma, or, you know, this line ending here. It was quite amazing, and she was wonderful. She also gave me courage as a young writer coming of age, because at her reading that night, she gestured with her hand, and she knocked the water pitcher and glass off the side of the table, and she just read gallantly. Well, Mary Oliver can do that. And I can get up there too. So I love this poem. When I was growing up, we had a house, a colonial farmhouse on 150 acres in New York State, and we often slept in the forest. My siblings and I would go out and sleep in the forest, so I love this poem. Sleeping in the forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed. Nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects, the birds, who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. She's such a mistress of last lines.
Yes, she
last
is.
lines. Yeah. The last line in Skunk Cabbage is, what blazes the trail is not necessarily pretty. And if you know Skunk Cabbage, you know that's Am I supposed to announce the next
You
person?
could.
Norma Gay Pruitt.
Oh. Goes by dozens of names.
What did your cover compare to that one they changed?
Welcome to the 1930s. I am Mary Oliver.
We couldn't have guessed.
You thought she was tall.
She isn't, or wasn't.
I want to read the poem that many people have sent me, and I put above my writing desk, just because every once in a while you just need to hear what it sounds like to do the real thing. I first met, never met her. I had a poem in the anthology that we used at Whitewater by Mary Oliver, and I didn't like it. So I didn't teach it very much, and then later on I was given American Primitive, which was the book that won her the yeah, thank you. Big prize, that's a peak. Anyhow, she then swept me away, and I didn't pay much attention for years, and I came back to her. But this is the poem. It's called The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And I want to read the tribute that I wrote to that. Mary Oliver, poet, died today, January 17, 2019. Finding Mary. I never knew much about you. When a poem lights me up, I try to stay away from the poet's life, since poets are not always nice people. Although I could have tea with their personas. For example, Frost, whose seeming accessibility you shared, but who was mean to younger poets. Or Pound, we all know about Pound's misplaced affiliations. He was mad, but still. But the poet who brought you to me right after you won the National Book Award was such an exception. He had the kind of warming corn silk covering his sturdy, not quite symmetrical body that you would sing about if you found it in nature. And the kindest eyes. He knew all things of quality. Haiku, playing baseball with the grace of a horse, a canter. He sang and played the guitar, of course. Call me a prairie fire, burning all out of control. He probably loved me, but I made a prairie fire choice, heading in a dangerous direction that finally burned me up. And how exactly is this about your wild and precious life, you may ask? It is me admiring your heart and the keeping most ugly stuff away from me so I could just think about that grasshopper with its pale forearms. I have kept a poem of yours taped to the wall in front of the place I write. Provincetown, a lesbian lover, a scarred childhood. I don't know, Mary, but you soared above, a mild-seeming hawk over bending grasses. Thank you. Everybody dies, you know.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I didn't die.
Okay, you get to announce the next.
Wait, what's this?
I'll announce it.
Thank you.
Announce the next one, thank you.
Susan H., but is crossed out.
She's crossed out,
Oh.
Susan Herring, she couldn't make
Oh,
it.
she's not
Somebody
here,
handed it to me.
okay. Nancy Mick, there's
Make
only a
fun- make
Mick. Don't hesitate. Being a librarian, the first thing I did was see, well, what are some of her poems that are well-known? So, I Googled. And I found, things that have been on chapter day. Lovely. I didn't know her a lot beforehand, before she died, and also, I'm not really a transcendentalist, sorry, George. I don't go out into the ground and investigate grasshoppers, so I went with don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy, joy is not made to be a crumb. And then last night I was with someone that I don't know very well, but who's very young, at least in my sphere these days. And I mentioned that I was coming to this, and she went, "Oh, I love Mary Oliver." She pulled up her phone. She had, like 5 poems on it that she saved just to look at all the time. So I'll read one that she had down. I go down to the shore. I go down to the shore in the morning, and depending on the hour, the waves are rolling in or moving out, and I say, "Oh, I am miserable. What shall I do? What should I do?" And the sea says in its lovely voice, "Excuse me, I have work to do." Crystal, all right. Now I go to the woods and the wild geese.
So I was gonna do, what was the first one again?
How I Go to the
How I
Woods.
Go to the Woods. And then I found out that Katie was gonna be here, and I'm hoping that she'll read her tribute poem. That, when Mary Oliver had passed, I had sent her Wild Geese and said, "This really spoke to me and made me think of you, and I want to see what you can do inspired by this. And she wrote a beautiful piece, so maybe if we all nudge her, she'll be brave. Okay, but on that note, yeah, a little peer pressure. Okay. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
Pat Hansen. I looked again at the interview that Krista Tippett did with Mary Oliver, and there was a section on there where Mary Oliver acknowledged that many of her later poems were very short. And she said, what's the point of bringing 50,000 new lines into the world? If you can say it in a few lines, you're just decorating. So, and she also said that she was very influenced by Rumi, who tended to write short poems, and she said that she read him every day. So I've chosen a brief one. It's called Instructions for Living a Life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it.
I didn't know that was.
It's beautiful.
What?
Katie is next.
That's all I need.
I'm so impressed by you guys reading these off of your phone.
I'm glad that impresses you.
I'm easily impressed.
I am in fact reading that rendition poem. So I actually just discovered Mary Oliver last summer when I was on a spiritual retreat, and we went to a used bookstore, and I was looking at all the poetry, and I opened one of her collections and instantly fell in love because I love the way that she just like observes the small, like little simple things in life and makes you open your eyes a little bit. So the collection in particular that I fell in love with most was Felicity. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's delicious. So this is my rendition of Wild Geese. You do not have to settle. You do not have to shrug your shoulders for the 100th time and throw your arms up. You only have to smooth the rough edges of your heart and let the breaks heal over. Tell me about grief, yours, and I'll tell you mine. Of course the world moves forward. Of course the trees sway in the winds that move across the earth and ripple creeks, lakes, the ocean waters. Of course the loons cry at dusk, hauntingly through the still night air, as they cozy up in the nest they return to each year. Wherever you are, no matter your strife, the world opens you and lifts your ache, like the cry of the loon, mournful yet peaceful, over and over, sharing your stillness in the chaos of things.
Meredith.
So I'm going to read from House of Light, which was in 1990. It's going to read, I can't resist reading two poems by her.
I was trained myself.
I know you did. But you put more preface. But I did discover her in the 1980s after American Primitive, and I I was with Mary Oliver back then too, we all wondered about her, like, what's she like? Who's she live with? She was very, very private. And as the years, very secretive it seemed. And then as the years went on, she became more open. And so I loved the Krista Tippett interview, and I think you did send me that. That's when I first heard of Pat. I so appreciated it. And I could just tell she was so in her own being, much more, just very comfortable with herself. And as she got older in the last few years, her poems kind of changed too, you know, and became a little more revelatory. And she talked about how she laughed more. And so I liked seeing the progression, and I only picked her up in the mid-'80s, but I could see a lot of change and growth. So that inspires me, I just think just keep opening. So this one is, I'm going to read the Buddha's Last Instruction, and I like it. I like it for a lot of reasons, but just kind of how she imagines, like what kind of was the precursor to this poem, like why the Buddha said to the people, make of yourselves a light. So she imagines from where did this imperative come? Make of yourself a light, said the Buddha before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness, to send up the first signal, a white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two solid trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour, knowing the light burns upward, it thickens and settles over the fields. Around him, the villagers gathered and stretched forward to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs, disattached in the blue air, I am touched everywhere by its ocean of yellow leaves. No doubt he thought of everything that had happened in his difficult life. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills like a million flowers on fire. Clearly I'm not needed, yet I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. Slowly beneath the branches he raised his head. He looked into the faces of that frightened crowd. Make of yourself a light. I always go back to the beginning, to that one, So I love that. And then the other poem I want to read, because I can't restrain myself, Allie. Lilies. Lilies. And I love lilies. I like that, Mary Oliver always loses herself in the natural world, in animals and flowers. But she knows that humans have a hard time absolutely doing that. And that's what the poem Lilies to me is. We have this consciousness that kind of makes us other, that there's a separateness from the natural world in us. It's a little Wallace Stevens-like, in terms of how can we absolutely be other? I mean, how can we absolutely be present with every other being and everything in the world? And we can never entirely because of our consciousness. Human consciousness has a self-consciousness about it. So, lilies. I have been thinking about living like the lilies that blow in the fields. They rise and fall in the wedge of the wind, and have no shelter from the tongues of cattle, and have no closets or cupboards, and have no legs. Still, I would like to be as wonderful as that old idea. But if I were a lily, I think I would wait all day for the green face of the hummingbird to touch me. What I mean is, could I forget myself even in those feathery fields? When Van Gogh preached to the poor, of course he wanted to save someone, most of all himself. He wasn't a lily, and wandering through the bright fields only gave him more ideas it would take his whole life to solve. I think I will always be lonely in this world, where the cattle graze like a black and white river, where the ravishing lilies melt without protest on their tongues, where the hummingbird, whenever there is a fuss, just rises and floats away.
I'm glad you brought
This
this
little bit.
Brenda is Brenda here somewhere. I would have been disappointed.
Who's up?
Brenda.
Oh, Brenda's not here.
Brenda DeVita, is there Brenda in the middle?
She's not
here.
She's not here, okay, Ken. Ken is next.
Oh,
She did too.
Let's just imagine what Brenda would have
I'm not in the way yet.
So I don't have a long history with Mary Oliver. We've had her book in our bookcase for 30 years. Corrected, so I went looking last night for a poem that spoke to me, and I like to trout fish, and so I spent a lot of time in beautiful places where trout live. And just This is called Lingering in Happiness. After rain, after many days without rain, it stays cool, private and cleansed under the trees. And the dampness there, married now to gravity, falls branch to branch, leaf to leaf, down to the ground, where it will disappear, but not of course vanish, except to our eyes. The roots of the oaks will have their share, and the white threads of the grasses, and the cushion of moss. A few drops, round as pearls, will enter the mole's tunnel, and soon, so many small stones, buried for 1,000 years, will feel themselves being touched.
Pat is next.
This one is called Children, It's Spring, Good for Today. And this is the lady whom everyone loves, Miss Violet, in her purple gown, or on special occasions, a dress the color of sunlight. She sits in the mossy weeds and waits to be noticed. She loves dampness. She loves attention. She loves especially to be picked by careful fingers, young fingers entranced by what has happened to the world. We, the older ones, call it spring, and we have been through it many times. But there is still nothing like the children bringing home such happiness in their small hands.
Sue?
I think I've been reading Mary Oliver for a long time, maybe since the 80s or so. But I feel like I moved away from her, or I lost touch with her. And when she died, I saw an interview that was done several months before, so very, very soon before she died. And I did notice how she was so grounded, so peaceful, you know, so sure in a way that she hadn't been. And it made me feel glad for her, you know, as if she was a friend of mine, and I thought, oh, what a nice thing. This is from a poem called Some Questions You Might Ask. Is the soul solid, like iron, or is it tender and breakable, like the wings of a moth in the beak of an owl? Who has it and who doesn't? I keep looking around me. The face of the moose is as sad as the face of Jesus. The swan opens her white wings slowly. In the fall, the black bears carry leaves into the darkness. One question leads to another. Does it have a shape, like an iceberg, like the eye of a hummingbird? Does it have one lung, like the snake and the scallop? Why should I have it and not the anteater, who loves her children? Why should I have it and not the camel? Come to think of it, what about the maple trees? What about the blue iris? What about all the little stones sitting alone in the moonlight? What about roses and lemons and their shiny leaves? What about the grass?
That's wonderful. Ian?
Yes, sir.
Ian? In the house? Oh, you don't know? Somebody signed you up.
Sorry. Sorry about
I was
that.
gonna say, it looks like George Savage's handwriting. Okay, I have Marge at the end with a brief excerpt from her book in progress.
Okay, since we're honoring someone who wrote so beautifully about nature, I thought I would take the opportunity to share. It's about 4 paragraphs here. This is kind of a big deal for me because it's moving away from being literary criticism as my main field to writing personal essays. And I'm really excited that this project helped me get a sabbatical next year, so I really think I'm gonna move forward on this in a big way. So the book is about Lake Mendota and my relationship to it, and it's gonna have 10 essays that move counterclockwise around the lake to different spots, starting and ending with Picnic Point, which is really close to my heart. So this is kind of like this is an excerpt from the first chapter, starting out at Picnic Point, and each chapter is going to get into some aspect of natural or cultural history. So this opening chapter, the history is geological history that it gets into. And I guess one more thing I'll just say is that you'll see even in this short excerpt that I'm really playing with the theme of metamorphosis. Okay, tiny toads spring away from our feet as we walk out onto this peninsula of land that curls out from the south shore of Lake Mendota like a little elephant's trunk reaching toward the northeast. My daughter Matilda carefully catches a baby toad, gently cupping it in her hands, and we marvel at its miniature perfection. These little speckled American toads are only as big as my thumbnail, newly metamorphosed from their tadpole selves. The sunshine of late June in Madison dances over the lake to our right, a shimmering needlepoint of white gold light scattering over the water. From the trees above our heads, we can hear the short trills of red-bellied woodpeckers as they poke around for insects in the bark. Treading carefully through the toads, we head toward the first path on the left, one we call the Crowfoot Path, because a tree root partway down its course reveals itself at the surface as a giant crow's foot. It's a favorite path, leading down to the first major beach, accessible on Picnic Point, a sandy opening on the other side of the elephant's trunk of land, facing the northwest. Matilda and I immediately began to hunt around for sea glass, although I suppose we should really call it lake glass. Pieces of colored glass, once part of a bottle, carelessly tossed aside or left behind, these fragments have tumbled so long in the water's ceaseless movement, buffeted by rock and sand, that they have become smooth, appealing treasures, at least to us. Our discoveries are punctuated with excited exclamations. Look at this big green piece. Mama, look at this one. We imagine wrapping our finds with wire to make earrings or necklaces, but the fun really lies in the discovery. Like the toads who shed their tails and transition from their watery world of tadpoles to hop about our feet, these shards have undergone a sea change into something rich and strange, a favorite phrase from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. In this play, the spirit Ariel creates a haunting song whose lyrics lead a young man, Ferdinand, to imagine the bones and eyes of his supposedly drowned father as reworked by the biological processes at work in the sea. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell, ding dong. It's a beguiling and beautiful song. The only sounds of any sea nymphs about today, however, are the sighs of gentle waves lapping and slapping against the sand. 2 mallards putter about in slow circles, periodically tipping bottoms up as they dabble below the surface for lakeweed, ding dong. Yet evidence of a rich and strange sea change does lie hidden in the very bones of this land I stand on. As I gaze along the shore toward the forested point beyond, I begin to think about how the geological history I have been studying makes everything around me shift and change, as if the landscape becomes a complex manuscript to decipher, a dense text of layered inscriptions, often written in an alphabet I am only beginning to understand. This spit of land I'm standing on now raises only slightly above the level of the lake on each side. Seen from a distance, this little peninsula sinks low and narrows about halfway out to the point, a small neck of land, only 30 or so feet across, that indigenous peoples once used as a portage spot for canoes. But even in the higher areas, as the land rises away from this narrow neck, it is never very high above the level of the lake. But imagine when this same ridge once stretched hundreds of feet high, a butte of land formed from Precambrian bedrock, shaped and defined in pre-glacial times by the Middleton River on one side, where I stand now looking toward Middleton, and University Bay Creek on the other. This towering landscape existed long, long ago, probably more than 20,000 years ago, before one of the lobes, the Green Bay lobe, of a massive glacial ice sheet that formed first in the Hudson Bay area, slowly rumbled toward Madison. In Wisconsin's last glaciation to date, heavy mammoth fingers of ice formed from compacted snow inexorably ground away most of the hills and bluffs they encountered in a relentless and repeated advance and retreat, playing out slow glacial rhythms of unimaginably massive power. When snow kept accumulating and increased the thickness and pressure, the lobes flooded forward. If the melting at warming edges began to occur faster than the pace of the accumulating snow, they retreated for a time. Wisconsin was invaded several times by the Laurentide ice sheet during the last ice age. By examining the multiple layers of drift, glacial deposits to put it simply, geologists can determine how many times a glacier has worked its way over a landscape. In her book, Wisconsin's Foundations, Gwen Schultz helps readers imagine the effect of these layers of drift by sharing the image of a skirt with underlying petticoats. The Wisconsin stage might be said to be the exterior of the completely visible skirt on top, with drift layers deposited during earlier stages being ragged petticoats dropping out here or there around the skirt's hem. So that's the part I wanted to share, and it goes more and more into geology and Paleolithic peoples for the rest of that essay, but thank you.
Thank you.
That's the end.
That's the end.
Would anyone like to read a second poem? Or,
Yeah.
Can I read the skunk
Yes.
cabbage?
by all means. But you have to stand up here.
I know, I have to find the poem.
Congratulations on your sabbatical.
Yeah, it was
an awesome problem.
And by the way, before you arise, I want to say I'm glad you worked in the word Laurentide. That's sort of an inside joke. That's where a lot of us have our offices now.
Dear to the
At
hearts of
Whitewater,
the English department, or hated by the English department.
Nice.
Skunk cabbage. It's almost time for skunk cabbage. Everybody knows what it is, right? Skunk cabbage. And now, as the iron rinds over the ponds start dissolving, you come, dreaming of ferns and flowers and new leaves unfolding upon the brash, turnip-hearted skunk cabbage, slinging its bunched up leaves through the chilly mud. You kneel beside it. The smell is lurid and flows out in the most unabashed way, attracting into itself a continual spattering of protein, appalling its rough green caves, and the thought of the thick root nested below, stubborn and powerful as instinct. But these are the woods you love, where the secret name of every death is life again, a miracle wrought surely not of mere turning, but of dense and scalding reenactment. Not tenderness, but longing, but daring and brawn pull down the frozen waterfall, the past. Ferns, leaves, flowers, the last subtle refinements, elegant and easeful, wait to rise and flourish. What blazes the trail is not necessarily pretty.
Let's give a hand to all the readers. Such a beautiful variety of reading, I thought. So there'll be another event in a few months for Agata. Hope all of you can come to it. And there's Prosecco awaiting you out there. Don't drink too much because it's icy out there.